holiday, and welcome back to GPE's Numeracy Webinar Series. I'm very excited to have Dr. David Chard, who's from Southern Methodist University, and he's connected us in the United States, and he'll be presenting mathematics instructional program. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to David, and he'll start his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully we're connected. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning and to talk a little bit about a project that has been ongoing for about the last year in Liberia. And the presentation that I'm going to give is really going to be divided into two sections. Part of focus on the development of a numeracy program that we've been working on with the Liberia Teacher Training Project. The second part, we'll briefly talk process for providing in Liberia, a little bit of a as it relates to how far we've come in the development of the project and where we're at currently. So we can begin the next slide. The first I want to show you our illustration of the need for improvement in early mathematics, sort of foundation mathematics understanding in Liberian classrooms. And the first slide, if you can go there, is I'll ask you to focus on particular data that's circled. Slide number 1, please. So if you look at these are a number of measures that we do a significant number of children across in Liberia. And data would say that, for example, on measures of quantity description, where children were asked to identify numbers was larger, they were unable to identify one of those in a minute. So, and unable to identify missing numbers in a series at a level at which would suggest proficiency with understanding of early number concepts. So a range of challenges with early mathematics development. Next slide. And in the process of working with the Liberian Teacher Training Project, there was some evidence that even if no effort was made in mathematics, was improving the teaching in the classroom, there was improvement in mathematics. Data you see here are, and I want you to focus primarily on the blue. This is improvement over the red bars when there was a full reading curriculum put into place. And you'll notice just improved effectiveness in the classroom seemed to improve mathematics achievement over those classrooms that were getting no reading at all. So it would suggest a context like Liberia where they're getting very little support in preparation for classroom, and support was provided even in a topic not mathematics, that it had carryover effect. Next slide. There is some sobering evidence, though, in the process of providing interim reports. What you see are girls' performance in grade 3 at baseline and interim on a number of those same measures in the early grade math assessment. And you'll notice that the delta on these is somewhat underwhelming. In some cases, student performance was decreasing rather than increasing. And if you go to the next, a very similar pattern with the boys who were assessed, that essentially there was no specific effort to improve mathematics instruction, and it seems to suggest across these specific measures. Result, please. Absolutely. Thank you. I wasn't sharing. So the next slide, and just what us to
David,
is looking at a number of these that demonstrate where we have high need, low economic status. We also mathematics achievement, and certainly that's most, if not all, schools in Liberia, and that we need to have some sort of understanding of where students are in their development of early knowledge and skills, how to support that. And in developing countries, and our observations in Liberia would suggest, we spent some time there about a year and a half ago doing observations, and the Liberian Teacher Training Project has done this over a number of years, has demonstrated that many are not prepared to teach in a way that would really provide students with the kind of proficiency and early math skills that they need. So a systemic intervention is necessary. Next slide. Yeah. So we proposed to the Ministry of Education, this was about a year ago, that would focus on taking the Liberian mathematics, was those in many countries in Africa would recognize it's very similar to things we've seen in other countries, and really not that different from the Common Core here in the US in many ways. So we wanted to base our the program we were developing on the Liberian mathematics curriculum, but the difference is we wanted to create something that was focused on helping children develop conceptually their mathematics understanding, and to be able to use models to illustrate their understanding, and then to really boost their vocabulary development as it related to their mathematics, so that they could not just do math, but help us understand their reasoning behind their procedures and their understanding. And then equally important, we wanted them to develop procedural fluency and flexibility with mathematics. We made one observation in a school outside of Monrovia where we watched a third grade classroom doing multi-digit multiplication. And so I asked the teacher if I could step in and ask a few questions. And when we asked students to try to describe for us how they did the mathematics, and if there are other ways to think about multi-digit multiplication, in most cases, if not all, they were unable to tell us what what multiplication represents, how you can explain why you can do multi-digit multiplication. Quite proficient in the procedures, but certainly lacking in their understanding of the process. So we wanted to really target those areas, but focus on the core area in mathematics curriculum. Next slide. You won't be able to see this, but this is designed to illustrate for you sort of the arduous task of developing a rigorous kind of curriculum. And so I wanted to show you this table. It represents the development of a scope and sequence. In the column are about 9 domains that are represented in the curriculum. And across the top are the number of weeks. And we developed a curriculum that was provided about 30 weeks of instruction each year. And inside each cell, you'll see what was expected to be taught that week. If it's red, it means it was to be introduced. If it was black, it was to be practiced and reinforced. And if it was green, I believe it was to be independently practiced and assessed. So it gives you a sense of how we tried to scope this out across a number of weeks. And I want to mention at this point that this represents the work of a number of people. In particular, I want to mention Wendy Ralangita from RTI, Arno Brombacher, Leanne Ketterlin-Geller, and Linda Plattis, who all helped work on the development of this scope and sequence so that it could be used across a number of projects. But a lot of intense work put into this. Next slide. So the resulting program looks like what you see here. And what's unique about this in Liberia is that in the recent contemporary history, at least, Liberian teachers have not had this kind of a tool. So you'll notice here in the red, these are teacher guides that provide, and I'll show you some features of these guides in a moment, daily instructional support for teachers. And the blue book is to work mathematics and independently math knowledge. Next slide. This program, by the way, was built by a publisher, Brattle Publishing, here in Dallas. So working collaboratively with RTI and the Liberian Teacher Training Project. So what you'll see inside the teacher's guide are weekly plans that are laid out much like that scope and sequence. So the teachers can see on day one what I'm introducing, what I'm practicing with students, and then what is independently practiced. And the teacher can see quickly what they're going to be covering in a 5-day period. Next slide. And it's identified by day, and as I mentioned, you can see the domains down the left-hand column, and each cell shows what they're to be taught and what's to be practiced, etc. Next slide. And then the daily lesson plans, which were really designed with the Liberian Teacher Training Project personnel so that they were recognizable to teachers. So there's a section at the top that gives teachers keys them into what the key subtopic is and how it relates to the Liberian curriculum, the kind of learning resources they're going to need to collect in order to teach the objectives, the daily objectives. And then it's laid out into an introduction with a time frame. Those are guidelines to help teachers know about how much emphasis to put in each area. And then there's an area called development, which was where they're supposed to provide instruction. And then it's laid out in an I do, we do, you do format. Next slide. I'm kind of giving you a foreshadowing, I guess, but you can see all of the details here of how these topics are laid out so the teachers can see about how much time and emphasis is to be placed. Next. And then this is the development. And you'll notice within the development there's teacher scripting that is designed really to give the teacher a chance to practice what they're going to be teaching that day, to, if they're unfamiliar with the topic, to kind of give them some background around the strategies that are going to be taught, and that they can follow directly if necessary. And keep in mind that Liberian teachers on average have a 6th grade education, and many of them are new to classrooms. So I think we felt like in our conversations with the LTTP team that they felt this kind of guided support for teachers was necessary. Next slide. And again, here's the we do and you do section with icons to help the teacher kind of keep track of where they are, and then a conclusion and a chance for the teachers to reflect and evaluate at the end of the lesson about what went well and what didn't go so well. Next. And then each day there's a student activity page that's related to some review items and some new items for them to practice. Next slide. Just another example of how it gets more sophisticated. And you'll see that they're developed to be as conceptual as possible, so they're building models into the actual problems. Next slide. And then I'll come back later when I talk about the teacher training piece, but we wanted to make sure that they had an opportunity for formative assessment along the way to make sure that if students weren't understanding and able to apply each concept or skill, that the teacher would be redirected to reteach. Next slide. There's a resource page that helps teachers collect what they'll need from the local environment for teaching and developing models. Next slide. And then there are some built-in materials. In many of the classrooms we were in, there was very little in the way of materials for teachers, numeral cards. You can go to the next slide. I think we also have a hundreds chart, which many of you will be familiar with for looking for patterns in numbers. Next slide. And then some rulers to help with measurement. And in Liberia, they teach both the metric ruler as well as a standard English ruler. Next. Okay, let me stop there and see what questions you might have. Mm-hmm. So there were two people from the ministry who are, I would say they're one step below an assistant assistant minister, I believe, who are curriculum specialists that obviously helped us with the transition from the curriculum to the development of the materials. And then we have a team of folks in the Liberian Teacher Training Project who reviewed lesson templates, but also gave us information on local contextual issues, particularly on resources that would be available in the community and for them to them.
So please type in any questions that you have into the chat box.
There was a lot of conversation
David,
about
there's
this,
a question
Jeff,
from Debashri. She wants to know who was involved from the librarian side in the preparation of these guidebooks.
And we did not create any record-keeping tools as part of the program. We weren't asked to, but I do believe that the ministry was working on some technical guidance as it related to how teachers might want to use the formative assessments. We did not want to use the formative assessments for grading, but of course there was, I would say, some drift in that direction that the ministry was trying to help teachers understand how they might use them in that way. We were really hoping they would be used for instructional modifications. Okay, so Emma, we don't have any data on the effectiveness of this program
Jeff Davis
yet.
writes, David, this is great. I'm wondering about record keeping by the teachers, for instance, on weekly tests, and what the teachers might do with the data.
For the interim reports prior to implementation. So I can't really answer your question. It's a really good question, Abby. Not that I'm aware of at this point, but it's something that I would like to ask the LTTP team, because I think that's something that they are doing in the literacy area. So it's a really good question.
Okay. There's a question from Emma. She would like to know, would you please repeat what you said about gender differences? What, was there less effect among girls?
Okay. That'd be great. I just have a few slides left, Deepa. So after the development of the first two grade levels, and I think that all three grade levels are now completed, but after the development of the first two grade levels, we were asked to come out and work with a team of about 40 trainers, some who work directly.
And there's a question from Abby. She says, I'm curious about whether any of these in-school efforts have been complemented with after-school, out-of-school informal programs.
Folks who are in the curriculum design group at the ministry. So we did that in August of 2012. And if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just show you a little bit about how we conceptualized that training. These were our objectives. We wanted to make sure, this is based a lot on the work of Miles
Are there any more
Huberman.
Questions?
Data really, or evidence that goes back to the 1970s about if you're going to work with a large group of teachers.
Looks like a couple of people are typing. I haven't seen the question yet, but maybe David can finish up some slides or the next round of slides, and I'll take the next questions.
Their understanding of why it's important to do it, but also simultaneously try to build their practice mastery of the use of the materials. So that's kind of how we designed this training of trainers, was to help the trainers understand how the program was developed, what the features of the materials are, how they would use the daily lessons and actually go through the process of practicing, and then talk about the selection of supplementary materials, how they would use the student activity book, and then in particular, I think a fairly complex idea is for many of the teachers in the Liberian context, is to understand the formative assessment system and how to use that to make decisions about modifying instruction. So that was sort of the framework for the training that we did in August. And it was a 3-day training. So next slide. I just wanted to give you a sense of how we broke out those days. If you just kind of look down this, we talked a lot about the conceptual development of the program, and then really giving the trainers a chance to work through connect it to the Liberian curriculum, but work through some specific lessons so that they understand how models are built, how to talk about those models with children, and then how to look for responses from children that would then help you decide whether or not to speed up the pace of your instruction or slow down and provide more corrective support. So a lot of descriptions, modeled lessons, and was done primarily by the LTTP team, or a group of master teachers in Liberia. And at the end of each day, we had a period for sort of reporting back and excuse me, and then giving them an assignment to go home and prepare for the next day. So day 2 looked very similar. The next slide. Excuse me. Very similar. And then you'll see in the at the end of the day, we spent time in day 2 talking about how to really vocabulary around mathematics, and then spent some time assessment and what reteaching means, and select supplementary materials. Next slide. And that's the tips for teaching vocabulary really were based on evidence in the literacy area about limiting the number of new vocabulary, focusing on critical words that are important to your instruction, and then giving students multiple exposures and having the teacher spend a lot of time using those words and encouraging children to use those words in their discourse in the classroom. The formative assessment really links to Jeff's question about grading. Of course, when we said there were weekly tests, the trainers immediately said teachers are grading, and we wanted, it was probably a bad choice to call them tests. But what we tried to illustrate here on the slide, we wanted them to see that once you've taught, during your 5, every time students are working in their assignment books, that's a chance for assessment to see if they're understanding what you're expecting, if they're able to plot taught, and it gives you a chance to immediately think about reteaching parts of the lesson the following day. And the weekly tests sort of sit outside that as formatively assessing at the end of each week, and then not rushing ahead in the program just because you're supposed to be on a particular day. And this was a fairly unfamiliar concept for teachers, and of course, as I mentioned, they wanted to jump in and use it for testing. I can't say we've completely reconciled that, but we're trying to help the trainers understand how formative assessment should reflect, it should be used to change the way you're teaching each day. Next slide. And then in day 3, we spent a lot of time where teachers were taking full lessons and working in teams to model those full lessons, and then we were providing some critique of the lessons, ways people could do things differently. And the trainers, I have to say, were really phenomenal teachers by and large, and had a lot of growth, and I think we're left this session quite excited about moving forward on training. I got a report yesterday from the LTTP team in Monrovia. They've currently trained 2,925 teachers across, I think, 3 states, which represents about 792 schools. So they're actively involved in training and monitoring of implementation. We've got an observation checklist that the trainers are using to try to get into the classrooms and observe teachers and provide feedback. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, these got repeated. You can go to the next slide. And then, of course, we spent a lot of time talking about supplementary materials, and you can look at these sort of guidelines, but we wanted to make sure that teachers were using materials that children were familiar with, so that the material itself wasn't the focus of the conceptual development, but they would see the mathematics within the materials. So a lot of into the training to discuss what would be appropriate materials for use. Next slide. Okay, that's concludes my presentation. So any questions you all have? Sure. Great. Mm-hmm. It's a good question. It was that question, Lincoln, was raised by trainers at the meeting for the ministry to explore. I think at this point, the funding for the curriculum is focused on a particular set of schools that are all government supported schools. And I believe that once we have data on the effectiveness of it, we're likely to see the ministry begin to make some decisions about, one, whether they're going to branch it out to more schools and more states, and then secondly, whether or not they're going to try to make it available at perhaps at a cost to the independent schools. So not probably a very satisfying answer, but that's about all I know about it. What I know is that these materials are being modified for use with Kenya. Project in Kenya under the leadership of is taking these and curriculum.
Was really a couple of questions.
Agency there within and they're doing
when we broke in the middle or stopped
3 grades in a
the presentation.
Testing
there's a question from Lincoln.
Those are the only 2 countries.
One of the reoccurring issues I remember from my time in Liberia was the involvement of private schools at
has the contract for the
in curriculum and the use of these materials. Maybe you have considered mention this, but how are they involved in this process?
Yeah, no, that was obvious to us too, Lincoln. I appreciate the question. Yeah, well, the Liberia Teacher Training Project has been charged with creating, I'm going to call them academies. They're sort of courses of study that are going to be offered through teacher training colleges, I believe, in each of the states in Liberia. So we are also working on those courses, although I don't believe there's been funding for that yet. But the idea would be that we would develop these so that there would be teacher preparation.
Asks, can other countries from Africa benefit with these materials?
Approach, and then teachers would move into classrooms and be able to use the tools effectively. I think that there's a period right now where implementation, Jeff, is being done with a lot of coaching related to it. And then there will be sort of interim data collected, I suspect, coming up this spring. And then we'll have a sense about how effective the rollout has been. In some of the states in Liberia, getting books into the schools it can be challenging. But we're told by the folks in Monrovia that things have been going pretty smoothly. There was a strike when we first got started on the docks, and I think that was a fear for some folks, but I think that's been resolved. So hopefully we'll have more data about implementation effectiveness soon.
Okay, and before I move on to Jeff's question, Lincoln has responded to your answer. He said, thanks for the information. The question came to mind since a large number of primary students in Liberia are enrolled in private schools.
If anyone's interested, can I just say, if anyone's interested in seeing specific lessons or Deepa,
Jeff
if you
has
want to send emails to me or something, I'd be more details
did you get
of things because we
what kinds of follow-up might be useful after the August training?
You know, when
sounds
these
like there's a lot of
funded,
enthusiasm.
You're often moving at a rapid pace to get things done. So we would have always loved to have more feedback, but great. I'll have to get back to you on that, Jeff. I think that the Medina Corda is directing this particular project, and I know there is an evaluation scheme for determining the effectiveness of the implementation at these 3 grade levels. I don't believe Medina's on the call, but hopefully we can give you some sense of how that evaluation is being done and what the timeline is. Great. Sure. Thank you all.
Okay. It looks like some more people are typing. Are there any other questions? Okay, Jeff? Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can post it on the community practice site. Yeah, under your webinar. Jeff has another question. He wants to know, what is the plan for additional follow-up project-wide assessments evaluations? Okay, any other questions? Okay. Okay, looks like there's no more questions. Well, thank you very much, David, for the presentation. This was very nice. And yeah, and we'll post the presentation as well as this webinar link on the community practice site so that everybody can access it and the additional materials that David mentioned. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I'll start my webcam again so everyone can see me alongside with David. So thank you everyone again for joining us, and look forward to continuing this conversation on the community